I'm playing a Shadow Priest build that can summon 1000 Shadowy Apparitions in a battle. In World of Warcraft, the Shadow Priest is known as a servant of the old gods, or at least someone who draws upon a power very similar to theirs, the Void. The Void is even darker than a fell magic, and wielding it always comes at a cost. As Shadow Priests embrace this forbidden power, manifestations of the old gods begin to appear, writhing void tentacles erupting from their own bodies. Shadowy apparitions themselves can be seen as fragments of old god power. In large-scale battles, this build is all about endlessly summoning restless spirits, flooding the battlefield with manifestations of the void, until the enemies are completely overwhelmed by old godlike powers. With the recent World of Warcraft The Midnight pre-patch, a few major changes were introduced. It's no longer just tentacles growing out of your body. Now you can summon a massive void tentacles directly. Yeah, at this point, there is really no denying it anymore. We are basically full-on old god servants now. Jokes aside, these new tentacles were a huge source of inspiration for this build. You could even say they are the reason this build exists in the first place. Let's start by taking a look at the setup. This build is focused almost entirely on critical strike. If you're still missing some gear, I recommend doing a bit more farming, or simply run a crate farming to gear up quickly and easily. With my current setup, I am sitting at around 40% crit chance in PvP. Race choice isn't a huge deal for this build, but I went with human. The reason is simple. Humans can run 2 damage trinkets, and for this build, that extra damage really matters. If you try the build I'm showing today, you will probably have a lot of fun with it. But like all PvP and PvE content, if you keep playing on your own, you eventually hit a wall. And when that happens, a lot of people will end up wasting hours scrolling through YouTube or googling answers that don't really fit their situation. That's why I want to mention today's sponsor, SkyCoach. SkyCoach helps you get unstuck by offering personalized coaching for both PvP and PvE. Instead of guessing or copying random builds, you get clear and tailored advice that actually fit how you play. What really sets SkyCoach apart is the one-on-one coaching. A professional player watches your gameplay live, gives you real-time tips, and breaks down your logs and replays so you know exactly what to fix and why. SkyCoach has many different services for the WoW that can be helpful for anyone trying to catch up with the game or just to enjoy it more. If you want to improve without burning out or wasting time, SkyCoach is a solid option to check out. They are trusted by over 150,000 gamers worldwide, and they provide pro-level support in other top games and more. Don't forget to use the special promotion code below to get even more benefits. Thanks again to SkyCoach for sponsoring this video. I just realized I haven't explained why this build stacks critical strike. The reason is simple: to summon as many shadowy apparitions as possible, exactly as the concept of the build suggests. By default, shadowy apparitions are summoned when you cast Shadow Word Madness. But there are several additional ways to trigger them. First, if you choose the Archon Hero talents, Energy Cycle allows you to summon apparitions while casting Mind Flay Insanity. So the first combo you need to know is very simple: Halo, Mind Flay Insanity. On top of that, with the Tormented Spirits talent, every critical hit from Shadow Word Pain has a 100% chance to summon a shadowy apparition, and that's exactly why we need critical setting for this build. To create an endless flood of shadowy apparitions, we stack as much crit chance as possible and spread Shadow Word Pain to as many enemies as we can. Let's take a look at the newly updated the Shadow Word Madness. This spell is the core of the entire build when it comes to summoning shadowy apparitions. In the end, this build works only if you can cast Shadow Word Madness as often as possible. To make that happen, we first increase our maximum insanity through Void Touch talent. Then, we reduce the insanity cost of Madness with Mind's Eye, allowing us to cast it up to 3 times in a row when our insanity bar is fully charged. But even 3 casts of Shadow Word Madness are nowhere near enough to flood the battlefield with apparitions. That's why we are using the newly added Tentacle Slam. This spell does a lot of heavy lifting. When combined with Misery, it applies both Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain to multiple enemies at the same time. But the most important piece here is the Maddening Tentacles talent. Without this talent, you can summon as many tentacles as you want, but Shadow Word Madness will never be applied, which means no Shadowy Apparitions. Once Maddening Tentacles is active, everything changes. Even though the effect is only 25% effectiveness, it still counts as Shadow Word Madness. And the moment that happens, Shadowy Apparitions start spawning again and again and again. Next, it's time to power up our Shadowy Apparitions. With just base talents, Apparitions are simply too weak to matter. First, we take Haunting Shadows to boost their damage by 10%. Then, Phantom Menace pushes them even further, increasing their critical strike chance by 10% and their critical damage by 40%. As you can guess, this synergies perfectly with our crit focus setup. After that, we pick up Spectral Horrors and Auspicious Spirits to further amplify apparition damage and increase insanity generations. There's one more reason I recommend the Archon Hero talent, and that's Spirit Well. It's a simple talent, but it directly increases the Shadowy Apparition damage by 10%. For a build that revolves entirely around apparitions, that kind of flat damage increase is incredibly valuable. Unfortunately, the Void Weaver hero talent don't offer any meaningful ways to enhance the apparitions. Because of that, I wouldn't strongly recommend Void Weaver for this build. This is where everything comes together. Shadowy Apparitions now generate insanity. That insanity fuels Shadow Word Madness, and Madness summons even more apparitions. What you end up with is a self-sustaining loop. Apparitions creating insanity, insanity creating more apparitions, over and over again. So in dungeons, the core idea is to wait until as many enemies as possible are grouped together. Once they are, you open with Tentacle Slam to apply Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain across the pack. From there, you chain into either Halo, Mind Flay Insanity, summon another Tentacle Slam, or build Insanity through Mind Blast procs triggered by talents like Shadowy Insight. All of that insanity is then funneled into repeatedly casting Shadow Word Madness, and that's the core loop of the build. Before we look at the burst, I want to be honest with you. This build doesn't deliver the kind of jaw-dropping, instant burst that makes your eyes widen. And depending on how things shake out when World of Warcraft Midnight fully goes live, it may never become a dominant meta build. As the expansion moves forward, the most efficient builds are already well known among players, but MMORPG were never meant to be just about efficiency. If pure efficiency were all that mattered, where would be the fun in playing games and finding our own path? At the end of the day, even if we enjoy optimization, we love WoW because of role-playing. And with that in mind, today I am playing a Shadow Priest that fully embraces the fantasy of an old god servant, a build designed to flood the battlefield with soul-filled shadowy apparitions. If you're looking to force a burst window, there are several ways to do it. One example looks like this. First, build up to 150 insanity. Then, buff yourself with Power Infusion and Vampiric Embrace. After that, activate Void Forms to increase your spell damage. Once everything is active, you chain the following sequence: 3 times of Shadow Word Madness, Tentacle Slam, Halo, Mind Flay Insanity, Tentacle Slam. When executed cleanly, this lets you trigger 6 consecutive waves of Shadowy Apparitions. Remember, this build is about overwhelming the fight with sheer numbers. This would have been much easier to follow if we still had an add-on like Trophy GCB, which used to display a clear timeline of the skills I just used on the screen. But with the transition into the Midnight expansion, a lot of add-ons were effectively retired. Unfortunately, Trophy GCD seems to be one of them, which is a real shame, because it would have been perfect for showcasing a rotation like this. Another unfortunate downside is the damage meter. With recent updates, a damage meter has officially been added as a built-in feature in World of Warcraft, but for some reason, Shadowy Apparition damage doesn't show up on the meter at all. It might just be because everything is still early and not fully polished yet, but even add-ons like Details are still running into bugs right now. Hopefully this gets fixed sooner rather than later. Because for a build like this, seeing the damage properly tracked really matters. Once Vampiric Touch is applied, Shadowy Apparitions will always be summoned and always hit, no matter whether the enemy is in front of you or behind you. Because of that, this build really shines in chaotic fights like large-scale Battlegrounds. It may not offer overwhelming burst damage or flash you one-shot potential, but it stays true to the core identity of a Shadow Priest. And this might just be my personal opinion, but there's something incredibly satisfying about it. Watching wave after wave of Shadowy Apparitions being summoned and pouring into your enemies. These apparitions don't stop. Like an undead army, they keep marching forward until the enemy is finally brought down. It kind of reminds me of something I have seen before. Somewhere in The Lord of the Rings, an endless tide, inevitable and impossible to escape. This Shadow Priest is undeniably a servant of the old gods, and if you ask which one is closest to, the answer is almost certainly Yogg-Saron. After summoning Shadowy Apparitions 20 times, you summon a Thing, a powerful minion of Yogg-Saron that fights by your side for 20 seconds. And as you've seen throughout the build, summoning Shadowy Apparitions is something we can do almost endlessly. Because of that, a Thing stops feeling like a temporary summon and starts feeling more like a permanent bodyguard. That interaction alone is one of the strongest and most fitting synergies this build has to offer. At that point, you're not just playing a Shadow Priest anymore. You're commanding an army of the dead, fighting under the gaze of the Yogg-Saron himself, and once that army starts marching, it doesn't stop until everything in its path is consumed by the void.